Welcome back. Hello if you're new here. Today I'm going to talk once again about the science fiction fantasy I've been reading recently. Including this video is a whole bunch of different books. We have something I think for everyone. The book I want to highlight in this video is a science fiction book that I found that I think is incredibly unique, and hopefully you haven't read yet. Hopefully I can put something new on your TBR. And I should say that today's video is sponsored by my tea as well as my cold and sinus medications. So I'm just joking here, it's not actually sponsored, but if you can stick around and deal with my stuffy voice and all of that, we're gonna have a good time because I have some good books to talk about. I'm just not feeling very well today, so send me some love in the comments. Now, maybe smarter booktubers would save the best for last, but I'm here to give away the goods because why not? So I want to talk first about this really unique science fiction book, and that is Tales from the Loop. Now, this of course has been turned into an Amazon TV show, so I'm not exactly talking about a hidden gem, but if you haven't checked out the book itself, I highly recommend it. At the time of recording this, I have not seen the TV show, so if you have, please let me know if it delivers a similar experience and if it's worth my time. But if you're not familiar with this one, I know that Moid from Media Death Cult also talked about it last year, so again, I can't claim to be the first one on the internet talking about this thing, but it is gorgeous, it's unique, and it's so different. This is a alternative history science fiction work that has artwork in it. I don't want to call this a graphic novel because it's really not that, and in fact, I think that this will appeal to a lot of people who normally would just dismiss as soon as I start talking about manga and graphic novels. I really think that this is going to appeal to people who, again, are just looking for something very different and perhaps a palate cleanser, something different between the big chunky books that they've been reading like I have myself. And so this one I actually read last year and for some reason never talked about on my channel, and I'm finally changing that. So I read it again and just really love it. I actually own a copy. This is a preview for one of my next book hauls. And so this is just a gorgeous edition. Essentially, this is an artist from Sweden where this book is set, and he drew these gorgeous pictures. Let me give you some previews of what's in here. And so he drew these pictures and then it was turned into this book. Essentially, it reads like a vignette of stories telling the experience of different individuals. It's not a full novel, so it doesn't follow one continuing plot, but instead gives little stories of different people throughout the time. The basic premise behind it is that it's set originally back in the 50s where there was this particle collider that was supposed to be built in Sweden, and then they fast forward to when it was built, and the story is following afterwards. So it's our past, but the future of this different timeline where there are these futuristic machines and designs and kind of a what if certain things were accelerated within technology, and then there was an economic decline. What if we just let our machines go to the wayside? So you just see very common life, but with machines and things that never came to be. It's creative and unique and just beautiful. It's the kind of thing you really do want to put on your coffee table and just let people peruse through. And so in terms of the story, I will critique the fact that I am someone who looks for a more cohesive plot, and I will admit that I like the artwork a little bit more than the story, because again, it's not really a full story. It's something you can kind of pick up and put down, which perhaps is more the experience with something like art, where you're just spending time looking at the images and reading kind of the meaning behind them and so forth. So it's a really interesting story. I know this author has done another collection, The Electric State, which I'm dying to get my hands on. I'd love to own a copy, it's just expensive. So I'm keeping my eye out for that one. I know that one is supposed to be adapted as well. And so I'd love to know if you think that that one is even better, how it compares, etc. But again, if you're open to checking out something like this, highly recommend. And again, I know this is an expensive thing. This is not sponsored by a publisher, nothing like that. I got this book through Book Outlet, which is my nemesis and my kryptonite. And so if you see it on there again, I definitely recommend grabbing it, or see if your library has a copy, because I've gotten my library to send this to me a few different times before I finally bought my own. So highly recommend this one. It's unique, it's different, and I would love to see more people talk about it on the internet, because again, I know Moy talked about it, but I'm not seeing a lot of other people talk about it, and I want to help spread the word. Next, let's talk about The Imposition of Unnecessary Obstacles by Malka. This is a second book in a novella series that is set on this Jupiter colony. This is supposed to be a sci-fi mystery series that is very much in the vein of Sherlock Holmes, and so we follow this smart detective. They have their sidekick, and in each story they are going to investigate something. In this one here, they are going to this colony because a group of students and staff members at this university have disappeared, and they're looking to find out what happened. Now, I'm someone who personally really likes missing person cases. I like the possibility that someone is not necessarily dead, but gone. And the reasoning behind that I often find to be more interesting than a simple murder case. And so the premise of this one really appealed to me. I enjoyed being back with the characters. I do like the setting. I find these books to be easy, almost cozy. Again, I love the back and forth, the banter, the relationship between the characters for me is a reason to read this series. I like it, but in terms of a mystery, which is another genre I'm really starting to read a lot more of, I didn't find the mystery as interesting as I thought I would be. Again, as someone who loves mysteries involving missing persons, it felt very simplistic, and again, a short package. I just don't feel like the author took as much time to draw out a story and a mystery that really was compelling. I would definitely read more in this series again because I can get these from the publisher. I'm interested in reviewing them, but they're not the most memorable, life-shattering books that I've ever read. They're a good time, they're a good palate cleanser. Again, it's a short novella. So if you're looking for something like that, hope you check it out, and hopefully this gives you a better idea if it's up your alley. Next, let's talk about Kinning by Nisi Shawl, and this is technically the follow-up book to a book called Everfair, which came out before. This is a book I received from the publisher, and I do recommend going back to the beginning if you are going to read this series. This is lightly science fiction in the way that it's an alternative history, but I don't feel it has other really large science fiction elements to it, so it's more speculative fiction. I'll put it in this side of my video here just to classify it. But this is a story that, while is technically alternative history and gets put in the sci-fi bucket, more closely follows a fantasy narrative. This is, as I mentioned, historical, so it's set in a time period. We follow this colony that is trying to rebel against its imperial oppressors, and so the story follows up the events of the first book, jumping into this one. And the reason I describe this book as feeling like fantasy is that it's heavily politically driven. So there is a cast of characters. It's very detailed in terms of their relationships and the maneuvering. There is lots of dialogue and back and forth. And I will admit that this book is very heavy. I was hesitant to pick up the first book because of the fact that it doesn't have the best reviews online. And I can see with the series that is simply just not a series I would widely recommend to everyone and their dog to read. If your dog is reading, I'm impressed. But regardless, essentially with this series, it is very difficult dealing with some very important subject matter. I think it is a very underexplored time period in a lot of modern fiction, and I think that it's saying really important things about oppression and colonization. But in terms of a fun read, it's not that. It's not the escapist fiction I'm normally drawn to, so it's a book that I appreciated what it was doing, but I didn't have an incredibly fun time reading it, which again, I'm arguably not supposed to, but I do look for some escapism in my stories, and I didn't find the characters to be the kind that I really was drawn to, or the story to be as compelling or interesting as I would have liked. So you can see my mixed review here. There's things I appreciate about this book, but it wasn't a knockout for me either. Next up, let's talk about a backlist science fiction, and that is The Legacy of Heoret. This is a book that I received as a gift for Christmas from my dear friend who is known as Distant Earth, and this was just a really enjoyable sci-fi horror read, and the guy knows my taste. So this is a story that follows a group of colonists who have been in cryosleep for hundreds of years. They finally arrived at this new planet where they're supposed to form a colony. However, the planet itself has their own ecosystem, their own life, and that life perhaps does not want them there. So in terms of a setup, it is this great rebelling against the human setup that I really enjoy in fiction. It's the idea again that when we're colonizing something or somewhere where we don't belong, perhaps not everyone wants us there. Now, this book also, as you can see, deals with large giant creatures that definitely feel reminiscent of dinosaurs, which again, if you know my channel, I love things like Jurassic Park. So this book was just really fun. It's compared to things like Alien with those alien creature features, and it definitely feels cinematic to me. So I have things that I love about this book, and then also some things I don't love as much. So what I think this book does really well is creating a story that I really could visualize. I really could picture the scenes. It felt like reading the transcript of a movie, which for some people it's a plus, for some people more of a negative, but it was action-packed. There was some gruesome attack scenes and things that I really enjoyed within this story. What I loved less was some of the dialogue. The characters felt a little bit stilted and campy, I'll be honest, and perhaps it fits within the story. Again, I think a lot of us appreciate some perhaps more campy sci-fi horror films, and so if you're open to reading something that feels a little bit campy on the page, that was my feelings or experience reading this book. So I liked it for what it was. Not necessarily an all-time favorite read, because I do think that there are things that could have made the book more developed, again, having more rounded characters. I don't think the authors were really going for those fully fleshed out characters. I don't think it was really the focus that was their intent, and I enjoyed this book for what it was. As I mentioned in my book haul, this is a book that was completely off my radar, something something I never would have read. And I love those kind of gifts because it's always fun to get something that is completely unexpected. I went in with no idea what I was getting myself into and ended up having a pretty enjoyable time along the way. Now let's switch over to fantasy, starting with Fathomfolk by Eliza. This is a book that I received for review from Orbit as an early ARC. And this is a story set in a fantasy other world where there are humans, but there are also other creatures. However, the humans reign on top of those other types. And so we follow someone who is half human, but also half siren, who gets the opportunity to be promoted within the city that they are working in. And so they hope that by getting this new position, they can help to bring in more equality or representation for their kind. And the story, of course, gets more complicated. There are different people and different prejudice and so forth. This is a story that I was very interested in. I will be honest, the cover when this book was first announced is stunning. I'm always looking for non-Western, more complex, different types of fantasy stories. And so in that way, this one did fit the bill. This is very much a case that this book is just not for me. So I find it hard to judge completely unbiased as to the quality of the work. So for me, I love a lot of the themes surrounding this book. So again, dealing with racial class and prejudice and so forth. However, the way that this book is handled, because of the mystical creatures that are woven into the story, this story had a tone of whimsy. And if you follow my channel and some of my darker tastes in books, you know that when things are light and sweet and cute, it doesn't always work for me. Again, this book certainly, tries to deal with some serious topics within it, but because it was so cute in how everything was described, I couldn't quite take the serious social conversations that seriously within the scope of the story. So again, I thought this book was all right. I think I never really got attached to the characters, which would have bumped it up for me. So perhaps for someone else, if you're more immersed in the world, perhaps you can look past the characters, which I found to be a little bit flat. So this book, as you can probably tell, did not live up to my expectations. This was definitely one of my anticipated releases. And while I'm glad I read it, I would be interested or open to reading more in this world. It's not quite the book that I was hoping it would be. If you love these kind of whimsical stories, this might be right up your alley. Next, let's talk about Age of Assassins by R.J. Bakker. This is a book that was gifted to me via audiobook, and I finally got a chance to read it. This is set in a world where there are assassins. We follow one from the perspective who is an assassin in training. And the interesting twist of this book is that they are not tasked to kill someone. In fact, they are actually tasked to save someone. So the premise behind this book is that it takes an assassin to catch an assassin. And so I really like the fact that this book took a different approach to a very perhaps overused trope within fantasy. Everyone loves assassin stories, but I think a lot of us have read them again and again and again. I could probably do a recommendation video on the topic if you'd be interested, but I don't know how well my fantasy recommendation videos always do online. But anyway, this one I really liked for a few reasons. So again, I felt like it was a different twist. I like the fact that the assassin was again in training, so they were not fully experienced. Certainly there were those around them that were more skilled in their work. But usually when you have these stories, you get this assassin who's so cool and suave and perfect. And this one, again, is still learning their craft, and you get to see them stumbling along the way. They feel like a real life person. Another thing I really loved about this story was the choice of a first person perspective. Now, I know not everyone likes that in fantasy, but especially as someone, I guess, who comes from reading a lot more thrillers, I actually really like that intimate perspective. And for me, it saved what I struggled with the last time I read R.J. Bakker, is that I found myself less connected to his characters. And in this one, obviously you're right there in the center. You know this individual, you know their thoughts and feelings, and it felt much more intimate, and I felt much more attached in that way. I still would argue that the character work was not the best. I was not as engaged as I should have been with this character, given how closely I was reading the story from their perspective. You think I would be a little bit more attached to them than I was. But in terms of, again, the narrative framing, the structuring, those elements were right on point for me. I believe this is the start of a series, and I would definitely read more. I enjoyed this one, and again, I'm grateful for the gift because it got me to read a book that otherwise, again, wasn't on my TBR. Next is The Darkness That Comes Before by R. Scott Bakker. And this is my first time reading this author. I believe they are very beloved. This is a grimdark fantasy that is set in a regressed society. So there has been an apocalypse. This is a post-apocalyptic setting where we have taken a step back. And so while it has the framework of something of science fiction, it is 100% reading like fantasy. But I love the setup. That is something I can read over and over again in fantasy. I would love to do again a recommendation video on the topic, although in some cases, sometimes it's kind of a surprise that the world is regressed. So that's kind of the holdback there. So again, love opinions if that's a video I should work towards. But within this one, I love the world and I just found it to be very rich. The characters, the story were easy to just fall into. I worried that this book would feel very inaccessible from things I'd heard about how complicated this author is, but I actually found it to be very easy. Right at the beginning, I found there were some quick paragraphs explaining some of the setup and who was who, and just understanding the different logistics within the world. So I like the characters, they were easy to follow. The world, again, was fascinating. It was gritty, it was dark. This is the kind of fantasy that, again, is less whimsical and more to my taste, just that it describes a world that is so imperfect and feels very possible and, again, grounded, even though we're looking in a world that is technically labeled as fantasy. So I really enjoyed this one. I definitely would read more by this author, and this is the beginning of a series, so I would definitely read more there. So that's it for this video here. Let me know down below of the books I talked about, which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? And I'd love to hear what is a really unique book that you have read, something just really out of the box, whether it be science fiction or another category. I always love, whether they be hidden gems or just something that kind of breaks the mold of a traditional novel. I would love to hear your recommendations down below. If you do want to stick around and subscribe, I hope you do. I do read a lot of horror, thriller, science fiction, fantasy, and other dark things. If you want to help me out with this video, you can give it a big thumbs up. You can drop a comment. Even if it's just a little emoji like a spaceship, lets me know you're here. And if you want to hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. Talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.